Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent de Luise. I'm the cultural ambassador of the Waterbury Symphony Orchestra, and it's my great pleasure to speak to you today about a fascinating topic within the domain of music and your brain. We're going to talk about the questions of whether listening to music can actually make us smarter, and can playing a musical instrument make us smarter. There was an interesting article in the New York Times Magazine section in 2015 looking at the billions of nerves that make up our brains and all their interconnections, and how all those myriad interconnections create our consciousness and who we are as humans, who we are as people. And one of the things that comes out of this interesting inquiry is that this is what our brain looks like on music. We're usually quite excited, and usually it's a positive result, and a lot of things are going on in the brain. And so why would that be? Why are we humans hardwired for music? There's been at least a 30, if not a 40-year inquiry into music and the brain. And it was popularized in the 1990s by the Mozart Effect book by Don Campbell that we'll talk about in a moment. Certainly Oliver Sacks's book Musicophilia that came out in 2006, I believe, and Daniel Levitin's book This Is Your Brain on Music have helped to popularize the whole domain of music and brain to the general public. So let's start by looking at that concept that you probably have heard about, the Mozart effect. What is the Mozart effect? Is it real? What does it do? Does it make us smarter? Well, we have to go back to the work of a French ENT specialist, a French otolaryngologist named Alfred Tomatis, whose method, working with the concept that the voice does not produce what the ear does not hear. And Dr. Tomatis used his treatment strategy of auditory processing integration to retrain the voices of some very famous people who had, in a sense, lost their voice, including the opera singer Maria Callas, the rock star Sting, whom you probably know of, Gordon Sumner as Sting, and the actor Gerard Depardieu, among many other patients that he had. Tomatis used specifically Mozart's violin concertos and Gregorian chant as the music for his auditory processing integration. He wrote a book called Pourquoi Mozart, a French title, which in English means Why Mozart, in which he discusses a Mozart, quote, effect, unquote. Fast forward a couple of years to 1993 to the University of California, Irvine, where Dr. Francis Rauscher and a group of cognitive neuroscientists did an experiment with 36 UCI undergraduate students. They had these students listen to 10 minutes of Mozart's two-piano sonata in D major, and then they had them do a paper unfolding test, a spatial temporal task test on a Stanford-Binet scale, kind of like an IQ type test. Then they had that same group sit in silence, and they tested them again with this paper unfolding test. And then they had that same group listening to a relaxation tape and then do the paper unfolding test. And they found that when this group of students was pre-treated with Mozart's music, there was a 9-point increase in their results, better results, for about 15 minutes. So a short-term improvement in spatial cognition. Why would that be? Well, the theory is that there's a relationship between music and the brain. The brain's architecture is very highly organized, and music is very highly organized. And they're both organized in a spatial, temporal type of way. And music and brain waves tend to have some similar firing patterns, and that might be the reason, the underlying reason for this effect. Let's listen to a few moments of the beginning of that two-piano sonata. This is a sonata for two pianos, so two performers, each playing at the same time. And you'll hear a bit of why they might have chosen this particular piece of music for the study. The two-piano sonata in D major by Mozart. So what you might have noticed there was quite a bit of repetition, and it's a happy sound. D major is a bright, two sharps, it's a bright tonic, a bright key signature to play in. And the second piano was imitating the first piano in a lot of different areas there. And they chose this particular piece of music because they thought that it would actually activate the brain more than, let's say, a more monotonous type of a sound. That was why they chose it for the study. However, other scientists, although some did confirm the study, other studies said that there was really no improvement. And whatever that effect might have been, it wasn't very long. It wasn't durable in the scientific sense. It just lasted 15, 20 minutes and then it went away. And the argument was that listening to Mozart, or any music for that matter, won't make anyone smarter. So you'd think that the Mozart effect might be dead in the water by 1999. But it wasn't dead in the water, because the year later, in 2000, two neurologists from the University of Illinois decided to analyze what if the effect of music might be on decreasing epilepsy frequency. So they had a group of epileptic patients, and they played music from a total of 58 different composers. And they found that the music of Mozart and the music of Johann Sebastian Bach and his son, one of his many sons, Johann Christian Bach, were the most effective compositions to reduce the frequency of epilepsy. So there's this Mozart effect to help epileptics. There's also a Bach effect. So there is something going on. And again, that high degree of repetition that seems to be in the music of Mozart and the two Bachs, that periodicity or repetitiveness at about 30 seconds, between 10 and 40 seconds, mimics the periodicity of one of our brain waves. So there is some relationship between music and the brain waves. Before this study, in 1995, Don Campbell ran with that Francis Rauscher study from UCI and wrote a book called The Mozart Effect, Tapping the Power of Music to Heal the Body, Strengthen the Mind, and Unlock the Creative Spirit. And this was so popular that, for example, the governor of Georgia mandated that all newborns in Georgia would get a Mozart CD so that they could listen to, their parents could play it for the babies as soon as they were born, and hopefully that would make them, quote, smarter, unquote. So it was a very popular idea back then. But then they asked Francis Rauscher in 2010, what is it about the Mozart effect in your study? And she said, well, look, you have to really enjoy the music you're listening to for there to be any effect. If you don't like Mozart's music, you're not going to find a Mozart effect. If you prefer, let's say, Pearl Jam, you're going to find a Pearl Jam effect. So she was saying that the kind of music that you listen to might be the reason why there might be some more activation or more attention and awareness afterwards in terms of doing a test. And of course, that led to the argument that any kind of mental stimulation before taking an IQ test would generate better results, that music changes how you feel, and how you feel changes your cognition, and that this was all wildly extrapolated about the Mozart, listening to Mozart's music in childhood, that it might lead to any cognition effects, any intelligence effects. And this doctor, Schellenberg, says that this link between Mozart's music and intelligence is tenuous, meaning it's a very, very thin argument. But there was something about the Mozart effect, about Rauscher's study, and about that study by the two neurologists that seemed to reduce the epilepsy. There's something going on with our brains as a function of listening to music, especially this kind of music. So if listening to music for a short period of time might result in a short-term improvement in some aspects of our cognition, can listening to music for a long period of time improve our mind for the long term? Well, it's complicated. Does music make you smarter? Studying music makes you smarter at music. Musical intelligence is too vague a term. Musical aptitude, is it from nature or nurture? Nature means, are you born with the gift? Or is it because in early childhood you were exposed to music? Or is it both, as this image shows? Is it nature and nurture? Where does music go in the brain? Well, it goes obviously into our ears, and there's also some vibration that we can feel, but it goes mostly through our ears. That's the organ of hearing. And from our ears, it gets processed first in the auditory cortex, which is this part of the brain, the temporal lobe, and various parts of the temporal lobe. It also goes to the frontal lobe, the orbital frontal cortex, where we have executive decision making. And a lot of it goes into our midbrain. This is below our consciousness. This is our midbrain area, where a lot of the areas that are activated also by dark chocolate, by opiate drugs, and by sexual climax create the pleasure of our lives. So music creates pleasure, and it activates that very same pleasure set of neural networks. The ventral striatum, the nucleus accumbens, the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex. And as those are being activated, the amygdala, which is largely an inhibitory nucleus that's also in our midbrains here, is inhibited. So if you inhibit the inhibitory nucleus, those activated areas are even more activated. That's what's going on. In terms of what music goes in the brain, we also know that it's not exactly the same on both sides. Rhythm and pitch are preferentially processed in the left hemisphere, our left hemisphere, which means whether we're lefties or righties, it's our left hemisphere that largely processes rhythm and pitch. Timbre, which is the quality of musical sound, and melody are processed more in the right hemisphere, whether we're righties or lefties. This fascinating video, which is a series of functional magnetic resonance imaging images, like a CAT scan, but showing blood flow changes, where red means more activation and blue means less activation. This is a series of patients, hundreds of patients over a long period of time that were studied, and they measured their brain responses to a tango music by the Argentinian composer Astor Piazzolla. Let's watch just a fraction of this video as to what's going on, not only in one side of the brain or the other, but in a lot of different places in the brain, our cortex, as well as the cerebellum, our little brain, in the lower back part of our brains, which also mediates our gait and our posture and our walking, which is how we would end up dancing to music. So let's watch. So a lot of different parts of the brain are activated by listening to music. Does playing a musical instrument make you smarter? Well, if we look at overall brain structure in people that are musically trained, there are definitely differences in the amount of gray matter meaning that's part of the brain tissue that we think is related to intelligence and cognition. And there's differences in the amount of gray matter that you might imagine would have specific reference to processing music, like auditory processing, and of course for instrumentalists, hand motor control. For violinists or wind players or pianists, our fingers are moving constantly, and there's going to be a lot of increase in the brain matter that has to do with moving our fingers, for example, on our left hand, whether you're a lefty or a righty. If you're a violinist and you use your left hand to play the violin, which is almost what all violinists do, the premotor cortex in the right part of our brain is highly activated, and there's a larger amount of gray matter there than there might be in someone who doesn't play the violin. Someone who plays the piano would probably have a lot of increase in gray matter in both sides, in the premotor cortex on both sides, because both hands are involved, especially in pianos and wind instrumentalists as well. So to look at that picture in a little greater detail, this is the auditory cortex here. That's the temporal lobe, which is next to the ear. That's where we initially process the hearing part. And then we have these areas, the premotor cortex and the motor cortex, and the frontal cortex, which are involved in the actual physical movement of our hands in the act of performing with the musical instrument. Does playing a musical instrument make you smarter? Well, this is the question of causation versus correlation. A study in 2004 showed a 7-point increase in the IQ of children exposed to either piano training, piano lessons, or singing lessons, versus an increase of 4 points over the course of a year in those children who were not exposed to either piano lessons or voice lessons. You'd say, well, what is a 7-point increase versus a 4-point increase? That's not very much. Well, it seems to have been statistically significant in that study, but a larger study done 9 years later refuted the claim. And the argument then is that even if there's a correlation between children who were exposed to piano lessons or voice lessons, that doesn't mean that exposing them to piano lessons or voice lessons was the cause, was the reason for the 7-point increase in their IQ. Does playing a musical instrument make you smarter? Children who play a musical instrument or who take voice lessons are more self-disciplined, they're more attentive, and they're better at planning. And these attributes can lead to better academic performance. Of course, you might say, well, maybe it's the kids that were already more self-disciplined or more attentive or better at planning that would choose to take lessons in the first place. That's that causation versus correlation question. But we do know, as I showed, that the brain architecture does change. That's called brain plasticity. When we play a musical instrument. Even if you're an adult who begins to play a musical instrument, there's still hope for you. The brain architecture changes in those of us who take up lessons, voice lessons or piano lessons, even as adults. Brain areas that control fine motor skills, memory, hearing, and processing sound are actually increased in density and thickness. And these areas can improve day-to-day actions as being alert, planning, and emotional perception. Playing a musical instrument is also like learning a foreign language. And so musical training, whether it's voice lessons, piano lessons, woodwind lessons, percussion lessons, that makes it easier to learn languages and also to have a better verbal memory in one's native language. And this all increases emotional attentiveness and empathy. So to conclude, does music make you smarter? Well, music leads to positive emotions overall, which then in turn lead to increased attention and awareness. The Mozart effect is transient, meaning short-lived, and specifically related to a set of specific tasks on spatial recognition. Playing a musical instrument or taking voice lessons increases brain areas. Certainly, if you're an instrumentalist, it will increase the brain areas associated with fine motor control. And playing an instrument increases one's verbal facility and one's empathy. And these are all good things. Let me leave you with a thought. Music gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything. Thank you very much.